Welcome back, everyone. Today, we continue on in our Intro to Reduce series, and we're going to talk about the top 5 tips that I use when using Reduce. Number 5, name your parameters appropriately. All right, so in both examples here, we're going to fold a list of orders into a list of customer objects. So each order will have a customer attached. On the left-hand side, we've named our accumulator and current item ACK and val, but it really doesn't tell you much about the expected output or what the underlying elements in the array are. So this would be better for writing functions like, like a flatten function where it doesn't matter what the underlying elements are. On the right-hand side, notice that we've named our accumulator customers. Now that tells you exactly what the expected output will be. We've also named the current element to current order, which says exactly what the underlying element is if you need to know that, and it saves you that half step of guessing what the thing that you're working with is. Number 4, avoid bloated reducers. Now, honestly, this is kind of a general purpose programming advice kind of thing. If your functions start to get too hairy or too unwieldy, then maybe it's time to dial it back and start refactoring and then break it up into smaller functions. All right, so big bunch of mess on the screen here, right? So it looks like we're calling this get customers function every single time we iterate, which is bad in this reduce function. And notice that we're sending an email and we're sending a text. So yeah, there's quite a bit going on in here, and let's see if we can clean this up a bit. All right, so if you notice, we could have just used map, right? We were really doing a glorified map operation with the prior code with just more ceremony. So now we're using map to transform orders into customers, and then for each of those, we're going to send the emails and texts, et cetera, all the side effecty things that we need to do. And that leads me into the next tip. Number 3, don't reinvent map, filter, any of those dot chaining operations. Just don't do it. Unless you're trying to optimize your calls, if you're working with a larger data set or something, or maybe as an academic exercise, sometimes it is useful to reinvent the wheel to see how you could write things in terms of reduce. I mean, that's kind of what this whole series is about, right? But in terms of production code, you almost never need to do that. So we should use the correct tool for the job. Remember, map is for transformations, filter is for keeping items based on some condition, and reduce is for folding data structures into new ones. It's about capturing intent. Look at how much more terse and succinct these calls are. They tell you exactly what operation is going to happen. Number 2, remember the extra parameters. And as far as this is concerned, I mean, it's just a reminder, right? We have access to the current index and the entire array in our reducing function. And sometimes I see people forgetting this. I've seen people try to use the outside array to try to find the index of the current element that they're on. And you don't need to do that. You have access to these things already. And the number 1 tip is always use an accumulator. Now, this is somewhat of a pet peeve of mine, but if you leave the accumulator out, you run into some weird situations sometimes. Let's take a look. All right, so all we're doing here is we're just going to tally the votes up as an object, which you can see down below. Now, let's focus on the left-hand side. Notice that I can see the accumulator passed in as the second argument to reduce. This immediately tells me the data type of the output. This is much more explicit, and I don't have to have as many guesses as to what the data type is going to be. But on the right-hand side, if you didn't know, in JavaScript, if you don't pass in the accumulator into reduce, the accumulator will be the first element in the array. That means we have to check against the current index to see if we're starting the iteration. But because we didn't pass the accumulator in, the current index will be 1 and not 0. That might be kind of weird, but think about it. That's because the current element is going to be the second element in the array. And the second element in the array has the index of 1. So as you can see, this is much less explicit and requires more code. There's going to be a lot more checks in here because I haven't passed in the accumulator. You can also kind of judge this by the squint test. If you take a step back and you just look at the shape of the code, you can see that the left-hand side, there's much less going on. Okay, let's take a look at some things coming down the pipe. I have a video on implementing object.fromEntries using reduce, which will take an array of arrays and basically pack it up into an object. I have a video on the array.reduceWrite method, which is pretty much the same as reduce, except for it starts at the end of the array and works backwards. That'll be a short video. And lastly, I have a video on transducers, which we'll get into that video, but they're a lot of fun, and sometimes they're tricky to think about. But if you're into kind of optimizing your code, that might be one to take a look at. And that's it. Okay, so that was the top 5 tips that I use when using reduce. So as always, if you like the video, leave me a comment below. Don't be afraid to hit the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon as well. And if they keep adding buttons, just keep hitting those. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.